Well, that would be.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming to class, to our magic class. Yes, I think I know everyone here. I'm Neven, and I'm very pleased to welcome Neil Mulholland, who's come all the way from Edinburgh to participate in this kind of second iteration of the project that I'm running in Tamworth, Ontario. It's kind of become a yearly ritual now. Which is, I guess, going by the name of On Location. It's kind of a working title. But I was sort of gravitating to that title because this place that we work with in Tamworth is called Tamworth Central, and they have a film studio. They're trying to build a sort of sound stage. And this idea of on-location film is a style of making films that happens outside the studio. It's also a style of filmmaking that is sort of vulnerable to the contingencies of place.
Mm.
The textures and events of a city kind of bleed in on the film when you're shooting in a wild setting. So I was kind of thinking that this program I'm trying to launch in Tamworth is being kind of a parallel to like Tamworth Central's other interest in scenography and application stuff. Which is just to say this project that I'm running there has this kind of ethos of thinking about Tamworth itself as a kind of active collaborator in creative processes. The thing I ran last summer, something happened, which was this kind of weird police procedural thematic where it was sort of declared to the group that something had already occurred in Tamworth.
Oh, yeah.
And it kind of tried to attune practices to this mystery or this question of what that event was, how it represents itself in the space. Okay, so that's like one ethos of the program is design these residencies that are place responsive. I'd say a second ethos is the idea of kind of unlocking the organizational qualities of the residency to the participants who are involved in it, who are kind of welcome to reorganize some of the prompts and structures that are being proposed by the project. So sometimes that happens through things like shared avatars where people kind of step into characters and they find themselves in a kind of game type environment. They're not there necessarily as artists, but they're there as part of some kind of proposed narrative system. Okay? Those are just a couple, I just want to put that as a background, like, and because I think this really, the thinking is in part inspired by Neil's work, and in particular, Neil's book, Reimagining the Art School, which talks about pedagogy and artistic learning. Not sure how, if it might find its way into today's talk, but the idea that artists can be creating the habitats in which they become artists and create their own sort of frames of reference in which to cultivate a practice is, I think, a direct kind of inspiration for the project. So very excited to have Neil here for many of those reasons. And we're also kind of approaching this talk as a sort of primer or initiate of the second round of On Location, which is called Crafting Magic. And I won't go too much into detail, and Neil will sort of talk about it more. But some of you are kind of already enlisted in it as journeyers and apprentices and members, and that remains open to anyone who wants to participate in this weird, rural, intensive. There's lots of opportunities to come to these workshops that we're going to be delivering over the coming month. So that's my spiel. What can I say about you, Neil, as an intro? I know I met Neil through the Confraternity of Neoflagellants, which is a corpus collaborative vehicle, I guess, with the writer Neil Mulholland, with an interest in neo-medievalisms, I would say, kind of, which my understanding of it is a sort of a way of looking at how medievalisms persist in contemporary life, or can be used as an alternative lens to understand our current predicaments or behaviors. So I'll hand it over to Neil as a background. And, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Neven. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. It's sort of interesting for me. I think it's the first time I've really spoken about this particular body of work, this project, Crafting Magic. Probably the closest I've got to it is just running the workshop itself, which I'll go into a bit in a little while, but I thought just to give you some idea of what it is before I dig away at it a little bit. It's basically two things. So it's a book, so this is a map of the book at the moment and how the various components relate to each other, and it's also a workshop, which is what we'll run in Tamworth, and they have more or less the same structure, but I thought rather than start with that, I would zoom in on one component of it to begin with, give you a feel for it, and then kind of pull back a bit and talk about the overall structure once I've done that. But I guess a lot of the ideas that are in here, they're also in this this interview that Neven and I have done together, which I can't seem to get it on the screen. This one, okay, I understand where it's hidden back in here. Yeah. So we've put together this interview, which actually covers quite a lot of the things that come up in the workshop itself, and maybe a few of the things that I'll mention today. So it's quite a long interview. It's not a real interview as such where we were actually going back and forth, but it's more like a kind of relay, I guess, like a relay essay or something like that. So quite a lot of the things are here, especially towards the end. So we were planning to make that available next week, and then along with the other materials that I'll go through just now, so that all of this material becomes kind of visible at that point. But yeah, I thought maybe where I should start was here, was just to begin with something very general about magic. So I suppose I started to work with the word magic and with what it might entail as a result of working on neo-medievalism, which is replete with lots of references to magic, and particularly as a form of resistance to like the dominant religions of the time. It tends to be used in a pejorative sense in the Middle Ages, and so it kept coming up as a thing that we would engage with. And then Norman and I were particularly interested in aspects of like medieval Christianity that have kind of disappeared because they would be deemed to be sort of extreme or perhaps too magical in the present day, and they've sort of withered away. Particularly things like the anchorite and the process of creating relics through relicking, which is something that I think underwrites a lot of what I'll talk about just now. So there was like an engagement with magic there anyway, I think, and I'd also been interested in, with Norman, looking at things like the technology of spiritualism, like ghost boxes and EVP and things like that, and I think also there was some kind of dabbling in stage conjuring as well. So it was really something that was opening up both ritual magic and conjuring at the same time. So I think it was something that I was already looking at, and to me maybe the key thing that was of interest was the fact that magic is something that most people have some understanding of, or they have a personal engagement with it, and they tend to use the term these days in a positive way, to describe something that they thought was good or had some kind of affirmation effect, whereas in the past it's predominantly been a pejorative term, I would say. So I found that it was useful in the sense it's a very everyday word. People use it as an exclamation, and at the same time, if you dig away and you ask people what they think it means, you quite often get quite polarized views. So a lot of people might fall more on this end of the magic scale, which is to say that they maybe associate magic with magical consciousness and spirituality, let's say, with something that maybe borders religion, with maybe like an older way of thinking and being. So something ritualistic, let's say, that doesn't fully seem to be part of the modern world, is like one way that people think of magic. And then the other side of the fence, I suppose, is stage magic. So many people will automatically think of conjuring, and their understanding of what magic is heavily influenced by the golden age of magic, particularly in France, and I suppose the props and the persona that we would associate with that, they have lasted till now, so they're quite kind of strong identities that run through stage magic. So you have these two different kinds of magic. Obviously stage magic on the whole is modern, and it's associated with modernism, and particularly in France, and like the expansion of the French Empire at the time in the 19th, 20th century. So there's a kind of schism right away between a kind of magic, you could say, that is older and is associated with potentially pre-scientific or pre-enlightenment thought, and something that is very much post-enlightenment and is perhaps closer to what we might call techniques, insofar as it's often concerned with engineering, with the creation of gimmicks and techniques for establishing illusions that are fundamentally quite mechanistic. They have to work like clockwork, and it's significant that a lot of the major figures in the golden age of magic were watchmakers, or they had some connection to clockworks, mechanical devices. So there's a sort of schism there, I would say, that persists in the present day in most people's comprehension of what magic might mean, and they will tend to sort of fall on one side of the fence or the other, at least initially. If you just stop someone in the street and ask them what magic is, they'll tell you one or the other definition, as it were. And I found that interesting because it shows right away that there's a kind of misapprehension around that key term, and that it could therefore be useful, particularly in a workshop situation. So I was initially thinking of this as something that would be a shift workshop. The workshops that I put together before this one were moving into that territory. I suppose they were looking at things like speculation, unlearning. There was a workshop that was basically alchemical that involved making gold. So they were very much like, hey, moving into this kind of space. And that seemed to me to be very much falling on the magical consciousness side of the fence. So I suppose what I wanted to do was deliberately try to exaggerate those two polarities and try to produce a workshop that would maybe force the participants to confront some idea of magic that's not the one that maybe immediately springs to mind, that is somehow other to their preconception. And that, I suppose that in another way is quite a specific quality of magic, because in ancient Greece, magic literally was a way to describe the magi, who were other to the Greeks. So it's a way of othering another culture and saying that what we do is philosophy, or it's religion, but what they do is magic. So it's somehow other to us. Okay, so that was for me like an interesting thing, is there's always this tension where you can use magic to create, let's say, to define some opposition, to create an opposition to your knowledge, and that again is a way in which magic developed through the 19th, 20th century, which is what I've been attempting just to map out here very briefly. So on the one hand, you've got an idea of magical consciousness in the present day as being something which we might connect to, I think, these three things. So on the one hand, it's connected to whole systems. So magical consciousness is seen as like a whole systems way of thinking. It's holistic. Everything is connected and interrelated, and there is no schism. Like there's no distinction between, say, nature and culture, or between people and nature and so on. There's a flat ontology in that sense, and because of that, magical thinking is often associated with participation, which is to say everything participates and relates, and would be maybe like an animist framework on the whole. So thinking of things as being alive and having agency, participating in this whole system, brings in that other common, there's another common trope, is the phrase relation or relational comes up continuously in definitions of magic. I'm thinking both in terms of like ethic and emic definitions, so whether they're from a magical, a group of magical practitioners, or they're coming from, it could be like an ethnographer, they tend to focus on relation formation and how magic is a process of creating relations, sparking them up, let's say, and seeing maybe what happens from that. So there's an unknown element to it as well, potentially, and like quite a lot of the time magical participation is a search for something that we don't know how it will work, and at the same time, of course, there's like an aspect to magic which is highly ritualized, and where perhaps some of those relations are seen to be conducive, to maybe healing someone, or allowing them to come into contact with like the underworld or spirit ancestor, and so on and so forth. So there's this kind of idea of magical consciousness, which is is very much alive as a concept, and I think is like a way of describing a whole vast array of different sorts of beliefs and thought processes. And on the other side here, you have with the development of modern stage magic, particularly among gentleman magicians. I'm thinking particularly, Robert Houdin. There's a shift towards something allied to the harder sciences that are emergent at the same time. So the trick brain, for example, Daniel Fitzke's Trick Brain is as a book that is predominantly focused on misdirection and like forms of conjuring. It's quite closely allied to something like cognitive psychology, and the idea that you could have a science of magic. So if you read the literature on magic in the world of psychology, it's all about using magic tricks to try and understand how our brains trick us, or how someone else can trick us and manipulate us and so on. It's very much, it's rooted a lot in vision, but sometimes it deals with sound and touch. But notably, it's very vision oriented, which is of course significant, right? So a lot of that kind of magic that's emerging in the golden age is it's sort of aided and abetted by this early phase of like cognitive psychology, and is leaning a lot on it, and so it's inherently skeptical. So almost all of these golden age gentleman magicians are skeptics, and some of them of course went out of their way to discredit and undermine what they saw as fraudsters. Okay, so they're golden age of conjuring has like a couple of qualities, I would say, where on the one hand, you could see conjurers presenting theatrical events that appear to be supernatural and leaning on the fashion for like the otherworldly, the spiritualism and so on, even using a lot of electrical gimmicks which were popular with spiritualists as well, before electricity became just a kind of common energy source, right? But they're using kind of, let's say, modern cutting edge technology at the time, like magnets, electromagnets and things like that, famously with Houdin. And what you have with Houdin in particular is a rejection of the way that conjurers would have presented themselves up to that point. So in France, let's say, they would have dressed to look like they were Egyptian, by which I mean the mythological place, Egypt, not the actual place, but the source of Solomon and so on, the source of the grimoires. So they tried to make themselves look exotic, and they would lean heavily on Orientalisms, clearly part of like romantic development at the time. But these modern conjurers wore formal dress, so they'd wear either like like a formal dinner suit, or he'd wear something that would sort of distinguish them as someone of their time, and as someone who would be, a respectable bourgeoisie in Paris, let's say. So there's a move away from that kind of Oriental Bohemian style, let's say, towards something that's maybe more minimal, like no mise en scène on the stage, like they're getting rid of the sort of apparatus of the Oriental and moving to something that's just very stripped back. So the focus is much more on the gimmick, the thing that you've got as the trick, rather than on you as a performer. So it's a total shift in that era, and it basically is a precursor of what happens with Dada and then surrealism to some extent, whereas the same thing, you have like the artists associated with those movements, that kind of rejecting a bohemian look at least, and moving to some extent to represent and present themselves as like respectable bourgeoisie, minimal, anti-theatrical, very similar aesthetic. And like Houdin is a precursor of that. It's like he's doing this like way before modernism moves in that direction. But I think while like Houdin is a debunker and would publish his tricks, so he used to tell you how they're done eventually, right? He doesn't keep them completely secret. The wave of debunkers, I think they come a bit later, like notably Harry Houdini spent a lot of his time and energy debunking spiritualists. So, he really went out of his way to sort of try and show that these people were like fraudulent charlatans. And, these modern stage magicians were, in contrast, they were truthful about being fake. They're sort of saying what we are doing is an illusion, it's not real, we're not in contact with the dead or anything like that, it's purely an illusion. And so you have an interesting thing, I think, going on there, where these conjurers are explicitly attempting to debunk what we might, on the other side of the fence here, call magical consciousness. So you could be someone who genuinely thinks that you're an oracle, something is flowing through you, it may be whatever that might be, it may be you genuinely believe it, it's not that you're trying to do sleight of hand type tricks to con people. But of course, plenty of people were doing that and still do. Like they're explicitly setting out to make money, and they're using the tricks of the trade, or the trade of the trick brain. They're using these kind of techniques that, say, Fitzkey was interested in trying to open up. So there's a whole agenda, I think, in magic at that time, which is, is a clear battle between these like spiritualists and anti-spiritualists. And then, of course, the spiritualists themselves got in on this game in a way, because spiritualists were quite often very scientifically minded, and still are, I guess. And so they would use scientific protocols and devices to disprove what the modern magicians were saying about them. They would try and debunk the the debunkers. So there's an interesting thing, I think, going on where you go so far in the direction of skeptical stage magic, you find yourself back in something that is it's not skeptical. Let's say it's like maybe more open to some other way of thinking, something that's not scientific and is maybe less focused on techniques, which seems to be a preoccupation over on this side. They're really into their like high-tech gimmicks, recording devices and so on. So for me, this is interesting because it suggests that there is like something, maybe, if we think of all of this as being magic, but there's some kind of type of magic over on this side that is maybe different from what sits over here, and this is like more modern. It's sort of disparaging what's happening here, really. It's trying to show that it was always just fake. It's just smoke and mirrors. There's nothing in it, and it can be shown to just be a bunch of tricks. They're just forms of misdirection. Now, to put that into a more recent context, I think this is quite an interesting book. I'm not sure if anybody's read it, by Federico Campagna. He's an Italian philosopher who's written this book, Technique and Magic, where he creates this distinction along the lines of what I just described. He's not really talking about stage magic at all. In fact, he doesn't really go there. He's mainly talking about magical consciousness. But for him, techniques is maybe something that, as he describes here, is concerned with the annihilation of things' full and autonomous existence. And he relates it quite frequently to what he calls the language of information technology. And he's saying here he thinks it presents this false picture of being capable of grasping the whole of the existent. So a good example of that would just be something like big data. The idea that you can capture more and more data, it gives you more and more information about everything, and that somehow that is a process that will lead to a totalized picture of the world, to the point where data can be manipulated and used in real time, where it almost becomes it's so detailed that it's no longer a representation, as it becomes the world, essentially. So he's looking at that idea of where things might become datafied or subject to quantification measures, or quantified in some way, where they might easily sit in that kind of world of techniques, of information and systems. And these are just two examples, that not that he uses them, but these are two examples that I would use to kind of illustrate that. One would be learnification, which is Gert Piesta's term for what is happening in education as he sees it. So he's looking at education all over. He's particularly looking at the European higher education area, and he's saying there's a in EHEA there's a focus on learning outcomes, and so if you have a course and it has 3 learning outcomes, he would see that as a form of quantification, because it itemizes what it is you're supposed to learn, and you can be good at doing that or not. So there's some kind of quantification going on there. And Biesta's term for that is learnification, that the process of trying to quantify education along those lines leads to this superficial focus on learning in order to satisfy that particular metrics, and it's nothing really to do with education or learning something. It's about satisfying the system's requirements. Nutritionism, which is Grinnis's term for a similar thing, he says like nutritionism is where people become fixated on the nutrients and vitamins that they consume. So you count your calories and you count, your vitamin C and so on and so forth. And maybe you tally those up for whatever reason. It could be it's a diet, or it could be you have, an allergy or whatever it might be. But you start to think of food in terms of its nutritional value, and maybe the ultimate nutritionist food stuff I can think of would be like Huel, you just drink this stuff, and it's like a meal that you can drink in a bottle, that kind of thing. So nutritionism is obviously connected to health information. So being told to cut back on fat, for example, would be a kind of nutritionist form of advice, which might seem good, that might seem like a perfectly sensible thing to say, but the problem with it is it's not holistic. So it's just treating elements of your diet as if they can be picked off individually. We can look at salt, or we can look at fat, and we can think of those things as being just data that are independent of one another, when clearly they're not. If you eat something, it contains all of these different things, and it contains the stuff in a very particular way as well, right? So the obvious example here, like a nutritionist approach to, vitamin C might say, drink a bottle of orange juice, and that will give you a certain amount of vitamin C. But if you eat an orange, then you consume less sugar, you have the fibre from the orange, and it takes your body longer to break it down. So the nutrition might be similar or add up in a similar way, but you're dealing with something that's fundamentally quite different, and it's being robbed of all its kind of its context, right? So it's missing all of that, all of the roughage, let's say, in this case. So these are two examples. You can think of lots of others, I would say, that sort of fit a similar description. But what Campagna is getting at is he's saying that there are increasingly ways of thinking and doing and being that are focused on creating data and information which rob us of all of the qualities that things contain or relations contain. So they're unable to describe those things because they're not analog systems, they're digital systems. So there's never a direct correspondence with the thing, or the thing is annihilated and replaced with data. You no longer see the thing, you just have the data that somehow stands in for it. So we need to, if you're like Skrinnis and you're involved in a battle with nutritionists and nutritionism, then you're going to push people to try and eat whole foods and sort of understand how to cook and things like that. That would be the the outcome of that. And maybe Biesta, it might be that you try to push away from the way that the curriculum is quantified, and instead focus on what people do, like the process rather than the outcome. So, various ways that you could respond to a technique's annihilating things would, in these examples, be a form of magic. They're a form of magical thinking, because they are explicitly pushing back against this idea that every single component can be quantified, and that we can disaggregate. The idea that you can disaggregate and unbundle is a misnomer as far as magical thinking is concerned. Yeah. So that's kind of a current thing in a way. Like there's a lot of other philosophy from all sorts of areas that's kind of saying something similar to that, I would say. And of course it does kind of make this debunkery have a very different feel to how it might have felt, going back at least 100 years. But of course, this still very much exists. So there's an interesting thing here for me to throw into the mix here, which is like that this kind of gentleman magician modern conjuring movement was taking place at the same time that scientific anthropology was being developed, particularly thinking European social anthropology rather than cultural anthropology here. But some of the core theories of magic that emerged in the 19th, early 20th century in European anthropology, they tend to see magic as some kind of impoverished form of science, or it's like a form of science that doesn't understand causality, or that it is like maybe like a kind of some kind of allocarism, right? So allochronism, sorry, that it's some kind of frozen culture that has never thought out and it still somehow exists in the present. So it's something primitive from the past that we nevertheless have in the present. So they would be using, I guess they're using techniques type arguments to try to undermine magical thinking, or to explain what it is, really, to debunk it, much in the same way that modern magicians did. And of course those magicians like Houdin and so on, they were part of the same circles, so they're like actually engaged with each other. I suppose there's been quite a good number of studies done on this more recently, where historians of anthropology have been looking at exactly where the work of anthropologists, who are beginning to call things magic or theorize magic, are heavily influenced by the conjurers of their own time, and they're even getting some advice on how certain illusionistic tricks might be performed, say in shamanic practices. So there's a doubling here. This has been described by a couple of different scholars as either dangerous doubling. So you have like process where the magician or the anthropologist set themselves up as someone who is a skeptic, who is like is going to expose this magical practice, but at the same time they indulge in it and they perform it, and of course they make their living from it. Like they're entirely reliant on this thing somehow existing. But you also have the practice of like stage magic itself. It's heavily reliant on kayfabe, which is already a double. The idea that the magician is pretending to be some kind of shamanic figure, so they're already a double, or like they're a kind of con man or something, I guess you could say. So they kind of put themselves in a very difficult position, I suppose, of like being a debunker, but also being someone who's like very openly fraudulent, or who's playing tricks like very directly, like making you see things that are not there and so on. So one of the key arguments that was made within anthropology in the very early 20th century, end of 19th, early 20th century, was that magical thinking was heavily reliant on analogy, and that scientific thinking wasn't. It's not analogical, supposedly, right? So that what they were trying to do was kind of squeeze out analogy as a method, let's say, and get rid of it. And if you read, all sorts of that, you read all different anthropologists from that era, they tend to, whether they agree with the term or not, they tend to kind of engage with things like sympathetic magic, like this, as a theory, or homeopathy, with the idea that magic is a process of comparing things and imagining that one thing will act on the other because they're alike in some way or other. So lots of magical rituals which seem to involve, let's say, objects that are used to act on someone's health, for example, to make them better, would tend to work in a sympathetic or homeopathic way. Like, they don't make contact, or they don't, they don't have any like direct obvious causal connection. And so, most of the scholarship's focused on and fixated with this like analogical way of thinking, and they're all kind of trying to get to grips with what that might mean. But
do you have some examples of what sort of objects that you're talking about? Like you're
yeah.
using in healing, so they would mimic the body that needs healing, for example? Or?
I mean, an obvious thing would be, well, it's often like proxy based. So you maybe do something to an object, and the object stands in for the person, or it's a question of like bringing two things together under the right conditions, so as the moon is in the right quarter, and it's got to be, the right time of night, the temperature has to be quite specific, and so on and so forth. So it's maybe, they would seem quite arbitrary to anyone outside the belief system, but they're not remotely arbitrary if you're inside it. But it could really, as I'll get to, it could be like literally anything. If you stand back enough from whatever the system, the belief system is it's operating, it really could be anything, and it doesn't even need to be a thing, of course. Like, so it could just be like an incantation or some kind of movement or a process rather than an object. So a lot of it becomes like maybe magical rituals that are very old. They become an orthopraxy, and they maybe just they kind of almost transform into sound, language. You get that a lot in like Hinduism, for example. It sort of becomes something that's more like a mantra, and the objects are long gone. You don't, so far that we don't know what they would have been. So it's not always like an object, but it could be, it can be, an object can be really powerful, but it could also be something that has no physical form, if you know what I mean. So it's more like a set of practices that are performed, let's say. So I think the thing that's interesting here is like, this is a common line of thinking. It's not just among anthropologists. So if you go back from the early 20th century through to even the 60s, there's loads of different people in different disciplines talking about the same thing. So like Conrad, who kind of theorized schizophrenia, he created what he called apophenia. And apophenia is like where you see things that are not there. It's because we are wired to some extent to see patterns, so we recognize patterns. And if it's at night and you're trying to find a light switch in your room, you might see something in the corner of the room and think it's a person, but it's like a pillow or something like that. That's basic apophenia. So everybody has this disposition towards apophenia, and we do it with sound, we could do it with smell and touch as well, but it's mainly vision and sound based. And Conrad's theory of schizophrenia was that this was a sort of delusional form of perception that was just particularly heightened in people who were schizophrenic, were unable to move out of a kind of chronic state of apophenic delusion. So everything that they see and hear, they think is something else that that it's not. So it's like they're overcompensating the possible threat of their environment. So that obviously is very influential. Like the whole definition and diagnostic manual, for schizophrenia, is based on that theory. And you've got Michael Shermer, who is a debunker, I suppose. But Michael Shermer talks about patternicity as being something again that everyone has. We spot patterns, and he tries to relate that to evolution, and he also uses it as a way to try to debunk religion. He sees religion as some kind of form of paternicity at large, writ large, right? So it's people sort of seeing things that are not there, and then they turn them into stories, they transform into rituals and rites and so on. So that'd be another one. And then you've got Jung's theory of synchronicity. So synchronicity is also, albeit, you know, he has a very kind of particular way of defining it. It's really, really similar to paternicity and can become delusional. So you could think that something happened as a coincidence is not a coincidence, it's synchronicity, but the more you think like that, the more possibility is that you might become schizophrenic or that you might be delusional. Yeah. So these are also the things that underlies conspiracy theory, ways, you know, kind of mindsets as well. And then you've got Bateson's concept of abductive reasoning. So a kind of riposte to the idea that we should deduct or induct, but abductive reasoning being a way of saying that it's perfectly legitimate, which is abductive reasoning is not really so different from magical analogical thinking. Yeah, and then very recently you have some theories of the weird machine. Weird machines are basically bits of code that have been hacked and start behaving in odd ways, but you may have experienced it, and then whatever it is you're using has been fixed behind the scenes, or you might just have tried to get like a voice assistant to do something and it's giving some really weird thing back that is way off like what you were looking for. It's often down to a kind of weird machine error, which is basically the machine being mismorphic. So it's doing something like not recognizing the right pattern or the pattern that it's supposed to look at. And you know, that's the main problem that we have with things like self-driving cars, is that they are almost like too good at seeing patterns. So they can become schizophrenic or weird machines. So these are all things that, you know, they're all interconnected, all these kind of ways of describing, let's say, magical thinking, where they're different disciplines, concepts of what that thing is, and they're more or less looking at the same thing, but describing it in a very different way. And obviously in some cases it's like a diagnostic thing, you know, Conrad, in his time, he's thinking like, this is a problem, how do we fix this? This is like a brain that's not working correctly, and you know, we need to fix it. But if you're someone that is, I don't know, if you're engaged in magical practices, then you'd see this as like a very positive thing. It's not broken, it's kind of the opposite. So they're all perspectivist, I would say. Like, you need to immediately understand like what the agenda is of each of these disciplines and the people who are working within them. But it's interesting that it keeps coming up. It's like the same thing. It's basically a kind of sensitivity to patterns, let's say, but perhaps where it tips over into being oversensitive, seems to be a common way to describe what magical thinking might be. Now, the thing that makes this interesting again more recently is because there's been a shift or a turn towards narrative and storytelling in particular, that in philosophy as well, you know, you have Douglas Hofstadter towards the end of his life saying that actually everything is just analogy, and it's analogy all the way down. Now, and this kind of is a refrain of a critique of the scientific anthropology, which I'd say started to emerge in the 1980s, which basically said, well, actually, if you look at what these anthropologists were doing, or you look at what scientists do, they're using analogy and metaphor and simile. They're making comparisons. That they're not doing that any less than anyone else, and ultimately there's no real difference here. Like, you can't say those guys use analogy and we don't. we only use numbers, or numbers are still something which can be used in an analogical way. So I think within philosophy you've started, at that point you start to see people saying, well, it's not just magical thinking that's analogical, but really what we have is like a capacity to maintain dual perspectives. It's somehow, you know, it's similar perhaps to like the ability to acquire language. We have this capacity to think analogically and to perceive things in an analogical way, or to, you know, engage in a kind of mismorphism. It's like a playful thing where we almost like try to figure out what the real shape of things ought to be when through cognition. So I mean, this has come from cognitive science as well. So Hofstede's saying analogy is everything. It's hardwired. It's analogy all the way down. That's quite a significant shift, and in some ways a riposte against the idea that you can have this, you know, you can have this purely skeptical position that somebody like Harry Houdini definitely had in his day. So that's where that's kind of where I'd started. Like I kind of realised that there was this interesting tension, and also thought it was interesting that people are describing something that's almost the same, but that they have all these different ways of describing it and trying to get to grips with it. So to just put it into a little bit of focus and just look at one thing I've been looking at is software, which, you know, for one of it's not a very nice, catchy way of describing it, but let's just say these are syntactical spells, which just means that they're, you know, they're syntax based. So it'd be a spell that's maybe said or it's written down. And I was thinking of like an artwork that's like that would be like Lawrence Wiener's throw the standard die marker into the sea, which is the work, you know. So the work is that syntactical spell, but that work could be performed. Like we could go and do it, and you know that would enact it. But we don't need to. The software is enough. This is the thing that's interesting about software, is like it doesn't have to necessarily be actioned. Like you can have it and pass it on, and you can change it before enacting it without perhaps ever having to enact it. So I found that this was interesting because of how it relates to Campagna's ideas about big data. So he's saying that the language of information technology can potentially grasp the whole of the existent, and we need to acknowledge that the whole of the existent cannot be grasped like that, like that it somehow sits outside of that. Now, I think the way that information technology and code and software are invoked in a lot of this philosophy is interesting in its own right. It is setting it up as like techne, it's like somehow on the other side. But when you read software studies, a lot of people who are involved in software studies are really into magic, and they understand that software is basically like a magic spell, particularly around the algorithm. And I'm thinking like going way back to like the 1940s and 50s as well, when it's a kind of a quite emergent thing. And you know, they're particularly interested in mythology, like the golem in particular, right? So so there's an interesting thing here for me. On the one hand, you've got things that are like very self-evidently magic, like the Picatrix, which is a grimoire, and it's logocentric. Things are written down. You can get a hold of the Picatrix, read it, and then try this stuff out if you want. But it's a kind of classic example of logocentric magic. And software, like modern day software, is kind of similar. It's like a set of instructions, you know, the instructing machine perhaps, but a set of instructions that can be that can order and give structure. And it could be something really simple. As I said, it doesn't need to be like some complex body of code. It could just be like my son got a t-shirt on holiday. I can't remember it says something like read this on it, and then it says you lose, something like that. and basically the act of reading it is the act of actioning the statement. So your logocentric magic could just be those two words, read this. As soon as you read it, you've kind of enacted the spell. It's like a pianola score, I guess, like a thing that just kind of automatically plays itself. So we've got loads of examples of that in daily life. There'll be signs in the building that are basically magical spells in that form, where as soon as you read it, you own it and you enact it, like no smoking, something like that. So we're sort of surrounded by that, and then when they become thicker, let's say they're thickened into something that's like a series of instructions, you might call them something like a manual or a score, like a musical score, or a recipe, on the soft humanities side of the fence. But if you were, if you're doing code, then you might say it's an algorithm, which is, not really massively different in that sense. So within logocentric magic, the algorithm, and especially like mathematical approach, is there, and very, very clearly it's like a very common concern, especially in like Jewish esotericism, with the golem, thinking the golem, the incantation to produce the golem, it has to be enunciated absolutely precisely, and any mistake that's made would cause the rabbi to disintegrate. So there's like a huge amount at stake, if this code is not executed correctly. So it's similar, with like algorithms, like they're connectionist, and we need things to be in the right place for the connection to be made. So if you ever find an old website and you click on a link and it gives you a 404 error, it's because this magical connection has not been able to take place, because that thing has disappeared or it's been moved somewhere else. So magical instructions, they require the things to be in the right place. They need to be the right things for the spell, for the instruction to execute, to bring them together and create an effect. And this is a really interesting thing, I think, where you read a lot around software studies. People use these concepts constantly, and it's just very well understood. And you will have experience of it where your link's not working, or you click on something, it's vanished. So the algorithm's like a connectionist thing. It sets up a system of relations or zones that allow things to happen, and that's a really crucial idea. I think that is common across a lot of theorizations of magical practice, and again, both from practitioners and, let's say, anthropologists at the same time. And it would make me think that something like maybe Campania would hold up as the as quintessential example of techniques, would be what Benjamin Bratton calls a stack, which would be like this complete big data information system where everything is contained and can be indexed. It would make me think that actually is continuous with what, in this case, we could call syntactical spells. It's a form of magic. It's not something that's wholly in opposition to magic. It is another extension of magic. It's just like a very extreme version of the golem, and it's obviously subject to all the same kind of folly, and which I guess is why the golem's such a popular mythology among computer programmers. So thinking of that, then just thinking about code, algorithms, software, it seems to me there's quite a lot there, just as a way to try to think about what would it mean to do something that's magical without necessarily, starting from the position of an insider, or trying to sort of figure out what particular body of practice is first. And it does seem like maybe there's this idea of installing relations. So Schmidt says that the algorithm has the possibility to install relations and not to define respectively stabilized sense systems. So it's not something that necessarily leads to a stable reality or something that's fixed, but an algorithm obviously is dynamic. And again, magical consciousness is seen as a dynamic thing. You know, it's flow, weather systems and so on are all like absolutely inherent in definitions or magical practices. And there's a performative dimension to it as well, so that performance within magical rites is interactive. It's not a thing you perform alone. So the stage magician interacting with the gimmick, even though they might not be, sometimes the gimmicks are just automatic. They make it look as if they do, like the magic's always sort of some kind of back and forth. So we've got a thing maybe where magical research is like a way to think about how these zones are created, what the system does to establish relations, but I think also why and how it might create something that isn't stable but is generative, so it's producing something new that currently doesn't exist, and it does that through this process of analogy and of making like connections between things that maybe haven't been connected before, where they've been, you know, separate and no one has pulled them together and said these two things seem similar or they seem like they could have some kind of relationship with each other. So there are lots of ways of doing that, obviously, that exist in magical systems of thinking, but for an example, one that's not explicitly magical would be Fauconier's idea of conceptual blends. It's like a very particular way of putting together a blend of like maybe two different things or two different concepts, and I think in some ways, you know, that work, like Fauconier's work, it's heavily influenced by this idea of analogy being there all the way down, you know, that it's like something that's just part of your cognitive apparatus and you can't help but do it. So that's one way. Another way would be to play this. Neil Fun, it's not me, not mine, Neil Agarwal's online website, which is neil.fun/. But this particular game that he's created, Infinite Craft, I don't know if anybody's had a go at that. You can play it on your phone. It's extremely addictive. I'll warn you. So, well, you basically you drag things and put them here, and you combine them. They sometimes make a new thing, but you can play it forever, basically. So that's a machine that kind of creates these blends or merges things together. But these are magical processes, I would say, and they're like, you know, they're performing analogy and working with that way of thinking. So to come back to like materials then, just to sort of finish this little bit off, but I was thinking that a key thing here is that the materials, they can't really be reduced. You know, you can't say that is a magical thing, but that isn't. It seems like, again, either side of the fence, when you look at what an anthropologist like Gutlich would say about the stuff, the materials of magic, it's just an endless litany of things. So listed here, you know, flowers, trees, hair, oils. I don't know, it's like an endless list. Maybe these examples are a bit more like organic, but they're just things, right? And then Jones talking about stage magic is saying something similar: sandwich bags, paper clips, rubber bands. So these are not organic materials maybe, but they're just a bunch of things, and they're really ordinary. Like, they both have that in common, that they're just like ordinary things that can be enchanted or somehow combined to create these connections that pulls them into some kind of magic circle and makes them effective, brings them into a new kind of set of connections. So I think that idea seems very close to the concept of the prop tool, or rather the prop. So Kendall Walton's prop-oriented view of the tool, I think is important, which is just to say that Walton proposed that tools, they really operate like props in a game of make-believe. So we can think of this as being what it is ostensibly, but we could use it as a piece in a game. You know, we could sort of imagine it to be a building, or we can imagine the water to be some kind of powerful elixir, or whatever we feel like. But what happens with this is the material becomes something else, like it stands in for something else, at which point we're able to manipulate it in relation to the story world that we are working with within a group, within the magic circle that you've established. But it's not simply a case of us as humans giving the thing agency. The thing itself has a kind of agency in its own right, and it will lend itself to some of those suggestions, but not to all of them. So even if you see, you know, little kids negotiate and play and deciding what the thing is going to be, and they keep changing constantly as well, it's almost like they're changing things up for something that's a bit more attuned to the possibility of whatever magic circle they're constructing at the time. So we could make anything stand for something else, and we can, you know, incant those objects, even, you know, as ordinary as they might be, but we're not stuck with the decisions that we make, or that we constantly will change and rearrange these connections. But the thing itself has a kind of agency, or a power in its own right, is a key concept I think you get from Kendall Walton. And then within like the LARP world, I'm thinking particularly on like Nordic LARP in Norway and Sweden in particular, and how they theorise this. You know, they're fixated with the idea of everything being a designable surface, which is just to say more or less what I just said, that you can use anything and kind of design some sort of intent, even in a playful way in relation to that, and use it during your live action role play as whatever you've decided it is. And you would do this with like objects, but you could do it with people, you know, you could do it with like concepts as well and have them stand in for something. So it's a designable surface that we're talking about, a material, physical material in the magical context is just that. It's a sort of designable surface that can be have a role to play in interactive storytelling. It's not completely inanimate. It has like an agency that, you know, maybe it otherwise wouldn't be seen to have. You just treat it as, you know, a bottle of water, let's say. So this concept of the prop tool is interesting to me, because it means the prop tool functions in a similar way to frames, like in theatre. So framing devices would be, you know, if you're talking about magic, it might be the magic circle, or gameplay, same thing, magic circle. A cultic milieu is how the frame is described in relation to the way in which cults are generated and how they replicate themselves. Yeah. So, you know, what works within a cultic milieu would not work outside of it. Or, you know, people might think it's nonsense, or that you're, you know, schizophrenic or something like that. Within the cultic milieu, it makes sense because all of the connections have a kind of meaningful place to generate within. So there, you know, you're able to establish some kind of frame that will work inside its inside the boundaries, let's say. So I think that you know, the idea of the frame is a concept. I suppose it's mainly related to theatre and psychology, but again, it's very similar to some of these other disciplines where they might describe it as a zone or an infrastructure, magic circle. You know, virtual archive is a anthropological concept of like how certain symbolic patterns are reproduced over time, you know, over different generations. That's another form of frame. Yeah. So again, you've got something that's got lots of different names, but it's definitely a thing that, you know, we can identify. We see people kind of using it, and you know, very simple thing to evoke and to work with, say in a workshop in particular. So just to pull this bit to a close here, I suppose what I was thinking about then with the design of the workshop was to try to focus on this idea of the prop tool on the one hand being the thing that's agential and has as much a role in the workshop or in the production of magic, let's say, as a person might, or as the effect that might be produced, or the method, let's say. And then on the other hand, to think of how these tools are kind of animated through some form of code. You know, so we think of the algorithm as being the thing that kind of aligns things and allows them to animate in a particular way. Then we have something that's maybe like a very basic way of establishing a magic trick, or of crafting some form of ritual magic, or it could be some kind of combination of both of those things. But I think the key thing with the code is that, you know, it needn't be in the form of like a code explicitly. It could be, it's a story that is told, as it often is in like a live action role play, or it's like a recipe, some sort of framework that allows this analogical process to kickstart, and you know, it pulls itself into an interactive relationship with the prop tool. Yeah, and as that interaction takes place, you get an effect. So it could be the effect is theatrical, and that would be how that's how the prop theory of objects is usually discussed in theatre. So it's like an aesthetic effect or an illusion, let's say, but it might be something else. I mean, we don't know what the effect will be until we start to experiment with this interaction between the code and the prop tool. So these are like really core things in the workshop, but for me, I think initially the code was the method. It'd be like what a conjurer calls method, like you know, the the secret of the way that the deck has been shuffled, for example. And then they have the effect would be the method is practiced that produces the effect. So they tend to only have those two things, method, effect. But clearly the cards, in case of a card trick, are as important as the method and the effect, and they themselves have a kind of agency, particularly if they're a stacked deck or they're a gimmick or something like that. So this has been a key thing, would be to add to like the classic conjuring pair of method and effect, would be to add the prop or the prop tool. And then the other thing that I've added is the performer. So we don't always have a performer in magic, but you know, maybe you have ritual performers and ritual magic, and stage magic you sometimes will have at least one performer. But I mean, it's not absolutely essential, but the performer is the other thing that's added to the equation. Okay, so to just show you what that looks like very quickly. Here it is. The workshop itself is it's kind of really I guess this kind of summarizes it to some extent, but it's basically made up of these four components. So we have a set of characters who are effectively avatars. So they're characters that are described in one word, and the way that the character is nominated is through the draw of a card. So a group of people are playing crafting magic. They each would take a card. Their card will have a particular character's name on it, and it would have a QR code. So there's a little QR code like this, and then you look at the QR code on a phone. It will take you to a web page, and that page will have a series of quotations which are all related to that character, and they're all contradictory. So they kind of throw up that tension, that Technics magic tension to some extent, but they're like different ideas about what that character might be. So the character, in a way, I mean, it's a common thing in LARPing where the key thing you have to do first is not be yourself and become a player, and the player is dramatised. You have a dramatis personae, and in this case the character is fictional, but it means that the players can perform as that character rather than themselves. So there's already like a layer, a kind of magic circle that's been drawn that you move within. And then we have a set of cards. They don't need to be in any particular order from then on, but you have a set of cards that describe a method. So the method is like maybe a technique or a kind of rite or ritual, a process, let's say, that takes place. And again, in the workshop, each member of the sect will take a card, and they'll have like one kind of method just for them. And the same thing occurs, like there's a connection from the card to the site where there's a hidden series of ideas about what that card might mean. And then the tools cards are, again, it's similar. The tool is much more along the line of a prop tool, so it's not necessarily like a hammer or a wand, although it could be. But it's something that would be used in the way that I just described how a prop tool functions. Yeah. So they're then drawn, and then finally there's like a series of cards which have different effects that might be produced. So the process takes quite a while. Like the group has to kind of work through the characters to begin with, and adopt them, and they have to decide which of the characters will be the lead, like who will kind of lead the performance, let's say. They've got to then work on which method they should use. So if you have 6 people in a group, each of them has to advocate for their method, but then the group need to decide which one they're going to adopt. And you're then moving on to choose and try and decide what you would do as far as the tools are concerned, and then finally effects. So these decisions are made blindly, like you might choose who's going to lead, but you don't know what you're going to pull as far as the other cards are concerned. So there's like no way of knowing it. You'll definitely get kayfabe, and therefore you can fit that nicely with the character of the trickster, let's say. You have no idea what the outcome will be as far as these cards are concerned. So they're a kind of unknown quantity all the way through. The groups won't have the same cards as well. There are always 2 groups, so they will have different cards, and there's no kind of obvious way in which they will land, let's say. So there's a lot of chance involved in just the draw of the cards, but then there's the need for the group to work out which approach they're going to take, and to do that while they're in character. So you've got to be, if you're a trickster, you've got to try and kind of think like the trickster and engage with the others in that kind of way, that way of thinking, let's say. Yeah. So what it does is it immediately throws up some things these are all things that are very core to magic in terms of how it's studied and what gets thrown up when it is studied. They're all like very common tropes. Like confidence magic is a massive thing, certainly going back to Italian Renaissance, which it comes out of like love magic, and it's obviously a huge industry now in terms of like corporate magic and so on. And Telekinesis is still really big. We have like a parapsychology department in Edinburgh that studies telekinesis. Cursing, people curse constantly. Coffee is like the biggest psychoactive drug in the world. So they're all things that are very, very kind of current, but they're usually old things as well. Like they're both new and old at the same time. Now the thing with these cards is these are the cards that Dan Brown in Edinburgh and I came up with before we ran it. And then since I've run it a few times, I've kind of stuck with the cards because I know that there are different combinations. It seems to work quite well. But I'd imagine that all of these cards are things that would be substitutable for something else, that you could just change it for a different thing. The principle would be much the same. You work through 4 decks, and each deck will have an effect and will establish a relationship with the previous one, and it will cause you to produce more complex set of relations between what's being thrown up. So the aim of this is to work through the cards and arrive at something that pulls them together. So as an illustration here, I've said, imagine if one of the cults chose the trickster as a persona and kayfabe as their method, decided the tool was cursing and the effect would be telekinesis. What that group would have to do is produce some telekinetic effect through cursing, kayfabe, and the trickster would need to be heavily involved in that. Not that the others couldn't be, but the trickster's somehow leading the way with that spell or that magical performance. So the group they've got to play it, they need to test it out. It's like you've got to play test it and arrive at something that works. So if the group are in agreement it works, then the magic circle is correct. It has its own logic and it makes sense to the group, then great. They then have the difficult task of making it into a grimoire. So it's got to be written down or encoded in some way so that it can be passed to the other group. So at the end of the process, the groups swap and they spend a bit of time with the grimoire that the other group have produced, and they try and figure out how they will perform the magic that the other group has produced. And of course it ends with like a performance of the two, well, I don't want to say spells, but because they're not always spells, but it ends with like the two the two groups performing each other's magic in front of each other. Yeah, so that's the in a nutshell, that's the flow for the workshop. And yeah, it does actually take a couple of days to do that. It might not look like it, but it does. So hopefully that'll give you a kind of feel for it. So I've mainly been focused on that bit there in terms of what I was talking about, and I've not got into. I mean, it might seem like I've gone into quite a lot of detail, but I really haven't. It's really done more than like scratch the surface of what's going on in relation to what a tool is or an object is in relation to magic, but maybe you get a bit of an idea of what is possible and why this might work as a way of pulling it together. Yeah. So I'll stop there, I think. I don't know how long I was talking. So, yeah.
You have good time for questions.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned parapsychology. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on the power of belief in all of this.
Yeah. I mean, it's a funny, so that I think one of the things that's interesting maybe where people who are either, whether they're inside the circle or outside, the thing that's quite common they talk about is how it's a social phenomenon, and that it's it's not so much that they believe in something that's separate from them, or that they need to have bigger medicine, I guess you would call it, like a god, something that's bigger that you have faith in, but rather that they just need to have some kind of social sanction from who's around them. So when we're playing like this game, it might just be a handful of people, but as long as everybody's on the same page and they're like playing the game and they're in that space, it sanctions people to make believe. So that is belief. It might be that you're only believing in it for 2 hours, but it's still, while you're believing in it, you fully believe in it. It's as real as anything else. So I think it's like a socially sanctioned thing as far as this is concerned. But obviously, magic, it does that, maybe sanctions on a much larger social scale, and then religion, religions can be enormous, and but they're working in similar ways, like they're socially sanctioned circles, I guess, and people are they're able to kind of reinforce each other's play to some extent, and like the ability to make these kind of analogical connections between things that otherwise might be denied or seen as unprovable, or whatever you wanted to throw at them. Yeah.
I have to run to my kiddo.
Yeah. That's okay. I mean, there's an interesting thing like called second spear. Do you know about second spear? It's like it's like a theory. I think it is to do with the Azande. I think it was Malinowski. I might be wrong, but maybe Malinowski came up with it. But it was this idea that basically it's like a group of people believe that a roof has fallen from, say, a barn and killed someone because of magic. It was like maybe revenge, an ancestor taking revenge for something that's happened. That's why the roof fell, and they fully accept, however, like let's say a causal explanation that the roof was old, or like it had been fixed in the winter, or whatever it might be. There's a clear kind of causal explanation as to like why it failed, in terms of engineering. But the second spear is still there, like that it happened for that reason, but it also happened because there was like an ancestor who was angry and decided to make it collapse at that particular time, because it could have collapsed 10 minutes later or an hour earlier, but it happened at that time so that it would take out that particular person. So that second spear, where you can believe in, like the techniques sort of explanation, but you could still have this magical explanation simultaneously, and they don't necessarily rule each other out. But the second spear explanation, it's like impossible to disprove it, which is interesting as well. It's like, well, there's not really any obvious way for me to say that it could not possibly be, because there's an ancestor who was angry and made it happen. So it's second spear is like a great problem. I think it's very difficult to make it go away.
Because I had a question more or less in that direction, which is where would you situate pre-modern magical systems? They are highly technical, and they have their own logic of causality, which is not a scientific one, but it's consistent nevertheless.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. I mean, because there are so many pre-modern magic systems, right? And the thing that's interesting maybe is like that they, they're mainly produced through like not through writing, but just through people passing on stories, or through some sort of
Tradition.
Yeah, tradition. Yeah, I guess like ritual, but movement. You know, song, dance, all the cooking. It's all like passed through an orthopraxy, so it's through the practice rather than through something orthodox that's written down that maybe potentially stabilizes it. And it's only when you get the odd something that's maybe like odd in a way is like the grimoire, the Picatrix, is it's odd because it is written down. You know, and normally that knowledge it's not, and when it's not written down, it's easier to keep it secret. As soon as you write it down, somebody can get it, and then they can copy it, and it's no longer a secret, and everybody's got the same thing. So there's with a orthopraxy, there's more difference because people start doing things in slightly different ways, and then they end up being radically different. And with the orthodoxy, where it's written down, it kind of starts to create much, tighter protocols around rituals. And then, say with the Catholic Church, they would spend a lot of time excluding certain rituals or saints and canonizing some of them and not all of them. So it's that process of like where the stuff that gets excluded from the official system, whether that's religion or science, whatever it might be, the big medicine, it then gets kind of discredited as magic because it's not official. But people will continue to practice it, or they'll even make up new things. People constantly sort of inventive and coming up with these new ways of doing science or religion. So I think it's the pre-modern stuff. Some of it survives, because it's never gone away. There's like lots of things that are almost certainly pre-modern that we still have, or things that we still do. But then there's a lot of things that have disappeared, or they've merged with some second sphere thing where it's science and the magical process at the same time. So yeah, I don't know, like the thing, most of the sanctions on like pre-modern magic came from religion, more than science. I'd say it's come more from like the big organized religions. And like certainly where I come from, like Presbyterians were the biggest persecutors of magic, and so yeah, yeah. There's definitely a thing at being in some places like where there's been a shift to like being modern in whatever way that's perceived, that there be some attempt to sort of persecute or eradicate these magical practices, and then they maybe often be said to be old or be pre-modern, even though they're quite often they're not. I mean, maybe the best example would be like the shaman in Russia, I guess, or what became called shaman, but the shaman were basically kind of being forced out of their land by the Russians as they headed east, and so they developed certain ritual practices that the Russians saw and kind of reported back to St. Petersburg, and then later further west into Paris. They were actually developing those practices on the fly at the point that they were being kind of pushed out by Russians, and by like Christian Orthodox Russians. And so what you get is like this weird thing where shamanism is like petrified immediately in this very particular point in history. It's like, that's what a shaman looks like. They do this stuff, and it's, they have I don't know, they wear antlers and they're obsessed with what's under the ground, when actually that was just very particular traumatic response that a particular group of people like trying to escape the Russians had at a very particular time. But then that's become a whole movement. You've got like core shamanism in California and stuff like that, and people do a whole, almost like a whole religion based around this, almost like a myth. It's the origin of the whole idea is very sketchy. Let's say, But yeah, and that's also a classic encounter with like the, what then would be Russia growing in power and it's Christian Orthodox and it's pushing out of like where Russians lived into some place where people are more nomadic and really have a totally different mindset, and they're kind of treating it as if it's nature or something like that, you know. Yeah. Does this make sense though? The what I was kind of working through, because I don't know if it does.
It does.
I mean, it does to me, but I don't know if it makes
I have
sense.
another question. It can be open-ended.
Oh.
Specifically, is how kayfabe works as a method.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want just to give us some examples of the spells that people came up.
Yeah, kayfabe's good. So what I was going to say, like, so you could take that and say, right, actually, we'll make it an effect, or maybe a tool that probably still would be okay. So they don't necessarily have these ones. I think could kind of move around. Like coffee could be a method. I don't know about it being an effect, but some of them might be able to move categories and still work. But I thought kayfabe was a method because it kind of is. You know, you can say, right, we're gonna pretend to be enemies, like two people in a group. They might decide to do that, and then that would be an act of kayfabe because they have to keep that up the whole time. But then maybe in a general way, the whole thing is kayfabe because everybody's got to pretend that they're in some kind of magic group and that they're going to produce telekinesis. So maybe that's kayfabe as well, and that you need to kind of buy into the boundary of your fictitious world and maintain it the whole time. But I think kayfabe's interesting as a thing because of the extremes that some people have taken it, especially wrestlers, right? But comedians these days, I was thinking of like Nathan Fielder, who's like total master of kayfabe, and you know, and you watch his stuff, he usually shows you some of them how like when he was a teenager he was a magician, which is basically what he's still doing. It's just like pure kayfabe, the whole thing. So it could be like comedy's quite good for that, like Andy Kaufman is kayfabe, or it works somehow quite well in comedy, doesn't it? But obviously wrestling, but politics, there are like there's lots of studies of like magical capitalism of late, and kind of maybe like pulling on some things I've mentioned, but going back to again, this is like Italian Renaissance magic, which was about getting rich. A lot of it was anyway, and and it draws a lot on kayfabe, and there are the obvious ones would be loads of people writing about Trump and his kayfabian training. So I mean, The Apprentice, he did it in pure kayfabe, like wrestling style, and he maintains kayfabe, like in terms of like the way he attacks people. They're always he always like attacks them in a way that's cartoonish, like as if he's in the wrestling ring, and it's completely black and white as well. It's like, and that's a wrestling kayfabe thing as well. No, you've got like your heel wrestler. I guess that's what he is. So it's like really interesting. I think kayfabe is like definitely a method if you think it like that. But it could be one of these other things, but easily a method, and people become real masters of that, I think. And it's like an art form in its own right as well. People obviously who are into kayfabe or practice it, they sort of appreciate other people doing it and taking it to further extremes, I think. Staying in the same bit. If you're a comedian, like not breaking character or like sticking with the joke well beyond it being funny, that kind of thing. Yeah, so that's an interesting one as well. So a lot of people don't know where it is, but I'd say that the more likely to know where it is here than in some bits of Europe where wrestling's not as well known, or it's varied a bit. Like I grew up with like British wrestling, so I did know what it was, but there's a lot of people who don't really know kayfabe. So some of these things will be like that. They might be, not so readily recognisable. But then that could be a good reason to make a different card, where you think, well, we'll make a card that will really work here for, because you have some insider knowledge about a place, and you know that it will kind of trigger people to do something interesting. So manipulation is always going on, for something like that.
The people are the designable surfaces.
Yeah, because that's like such a common concept among LARPers. I mean, they might not always call it that, but they just take it for granted, and the more practiced they are at it, they just go for it right away. It's quite something to see, I think. But then I was thinking designable surfaces is like, say people go into an escape room, and then they mistakenly think that they've found a clue or they've found the exit, and they end up causing a lot of damage, like ripping the wall apart or something, or they spend way too long looking at some damp on the wall because they think it's a clue. So that's like your, that's like mismorphism again, like just recognizing the pattern, but actually you've spotted something that's not a pattern, it's just a stain or something like that. So I find that really interesting as well, because obviously you can engineer that to some extent, but at the same time you can't. Like immersive game designers have this constant problem with people mistaking things for like the clue or the game piece when it's really just the ambience. So that feels like quite, productive to me as well. Yeah. But yeah, hopefully you see how it's, it can be quite radically remixed, because the structure is in a way to have something that forces you to work with the relations between, let's say, the four suits of cards, like whatever they throw up, to establish relations and create some kind of story that will work around that, and then perform with those things so they become, you're transforming them simply by agreeing what they're going to do and like how you're going to put them to work. Yeah. Yeah.
Are we closing in just over 5 minutes?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think we are.